Hello, I'm Dr. Jen Frahm, and it's fantastic to have you with us on this webinar around the post-pandemic brain and change. For those of you who don't know me, you can consider that I have got a portfolio career. So I am the co-founder and managing director of the Agile Change Leadership Institute. We're a training and development company. I'm also an experienced change consultant and change manager. So I stay on the tools. I'm working in organizations on a regular basis, working through the same challenges that you're facing. And for my sins, I have been an academic, and my area of specialization was organizational studies. So my PhD looked at change management and communication. Some of you might know me through my books, 2017, Conversations of Change, 2020 with Lena Ross, the Agile Change Playbook, and then 2021, Change Leader. I've been writing and talking about this space of neuroscience and change for some 11 years now. So 2013, I did my first step into learning formally about it. I blogged about it. I podcasted about it. It's an area that I am incredibly passionate about for the reason that it makes such a difference to the way we do our work. Now, for those who like a little bit of structure, here's what we're going to be covering in this webinar. I'm going to introduce you with a little bit of a story about how we got to be here and some theories I have around why that might be so. I'll take you through our operating principles of our brains, how that contributes to a perfect change storm. Then we're going to look at three areas specifically. So the rise of trauma impact in the workplace, the decline of brain function in the workplace, and then the increase in neurodiversity, and how those three areas impact on both people in terms of their ability to absorb change and adopt change, but also what we should be doing about it. I'll finish off with a bit of a hint around what brain-friendly change tools are, and then we'll look at what the next steps are. So how did we get here? Well, it was back in, I think, 2021. That was in the height of the lockdowns in Melbourne. So I live in Melbourne, Australia. Melbourne is renowned as the lockdown capital of the world when it came to the pandemic, with the most days in lockdown. And there was one day in particular, I went out to get a coffee, which meant I could do my walk in my 5-kilometre zone. And at the time, I was working in a bank, and I was responsible for the adoption of a range of automation releases. And when I went to the cafe to pick up the takeaway coffee, because we weren't allowed inside, I ran into another change practitioner that I knew from one of the other banks. And so we just stopped to have a little bit of a chat around what was happening. And in sharing stories, we recognized that we were both seeing the same kind of things in our environment at the moment, which was stakeholders who were coming into meetings claiming to have no knowledge of what we were talking about, being really frustrated and angry around these relatively small changes that we were trying to introduce. They were refusing, and we're talking the more senior leaders and the senior managers who were responsible for signing off on things were not signing off on things, saying that they knew nothing about it. And yet both of us had been in the meetings and the briefing sessions and in the previous work with them, which we knew that they were fully involved and had been taken through everything from the beginning. And the other change practitioner said to me, I feel like I'm working with people who have got acquired brain injuries. And this prompted some real thinking and conversations with other change practitioners, more virtually at that point, to say, hey, what are you seeing around the place? And there was a very unique consistency with people that we were dealing with in our change programs were really struggling. And it wasn't so much struggling with the adoption of change, although that was there. It was more the executive function that came to making decisions about changes and then how we implement it. Which has me thinking then, why might this be so? And looking around the place, connecting the dots, bit of searchlight intelligence, I think that there are three things happening. The first thing is this notion of cumulative trauma. and the impact that is having on the workplace. The second thing is this advent of COVID-related brain fog, fatigue, mental health decline that we're seeing in the workforce. And then third, we're also seeing an increase in neurodiversity in the workforce, which I think is presenting as a different change audience that we haven't considered before. Now, it is important at this point to recognize that correlation is not causation. So the pandemic has not caused an increase in neurodiversity in the workforce. We'll get into that in a moment. But it's happening alongside two other areas which have been caused by the pandemic. And so this is creating a really challenging space for change practitioners. If we look at the studies and the research, and so to do this piece of work, to do this presentation, I looked at research studies that were published post 2020. And the research shows us that there has been an increase in all of these things, right? So climate crisis events, cost of living, hate crimes, gun deaths, anxiety, loneliness, women diagnosed with ADHD, our allostatic load, which is our chronic stress, depression, violence against women, people diagnosed with autism, proximity to global wars, threats to health and livelihood. Some of you at this point might find that your chests are tightening just listening and reading this slide. And if it is, it gives us some insight into what's actually happening for the people in organisations. Corresponding with that, there's been a decrease in trust in authorities, trust in public health media. There's been a decrease in IQ, a decrease in memory, a decrease in social cohesion, and a decrease in attention. Shout out to everybody who's reading Stolen Focus at the moment. You'll be really familiar with this. So, when we think about those stakeholders and what the other change practitioner and I were seeing, it's probably not surprising. Now, let's have a look at how our brain works. If we're thinking about any time, pandemic or not, stable state, our brain works on 4 operating principles. Safety and reward, it's a social organ, it's a prediction machine, and it's an energy conservationist. What does this mean? So, one of the primary operating principles of our brain is to maximize safety and reward. So our brains want to minimize threat and maximize reward. And this really drives so much of the way we think and what we do is because our brain is wanting to survive and it trumps all of our other functions. Change is understood as a threat, right? So we know that that's the way that our brain recognizes. And I should say there's sudden change. So there is a tolerance of evolutionary change, but sudden change is something that comes up on our threat indicators to safety and reward. Now, our brain is also a social organ, and being social and connection and belonging represents how we survive. So we know from the neuroscience technology that exclusion and change in relationship patterns lights up the same part of your brain as physical pain. So we know that change can disrupt relationships, and that hurts for people. Third, our brain is a prediction machine, and our brains expend a lot of energy connecting the dots and closing the gaps of the unknown. So routines and habits are efficient. When we introduce change, they're new and novel concepts, and that's going to create a heavy load for our prediction machine. So people often say that people hate change, and we know that if we're looking at David Rock's SCARF model, that certainty is privileged. This is to do with the prediction machine. So when we have a high level of certainty, our brain is reducing the amount of energy it exerts. And this relates to the 4th operating principle, that our brain is fundamentally an energy conservationist. So our brains weigh 2% of our body weight, but it consumes 20% of our energy. Whenever we have to learn new things, it requires upfront effort. And so change, quite frankly, is draining. So I've hypothesized that cumulative trauma, COVID-related brain fog and fatigue and mental health decline, and the increase in neurodiverse workforce is creating a really, really challenging environment for us post-pandemic. and we've got all of these things happening that we can see. We now know that when we add change to the mix, we're adding a threat, disruption to relationships, draining, and a heavy load. Is it any wonder that if you were a change manager or a change leader or a change practitioner trying to do change post-pandemic, you are faced with a whole stack of brains exploding in front of you? We are clearly seeing evidence of fight in terms of people being really aggressive around what we're trying to do. People are checking out of the changes that we're doing, and they're not acknowledging that they've been involved. They're freezing, so they have a level of paralysis in terms of what do I do? What should I do? If we look at some of the more contemporary responses to, stress and threat to survival, we're seeing people in exhibiting examples of fawning. And so fawning is where you may defer to someone more senior to you or ingratiate yourself with somebody for their protection. We're also seeing, when we talk about protection, tend and befriend is also a common survival technique where people seek to come together with other people, look after them as a way of protecting them from further change. So really, there's no wonder that that change manager and I were seeing a radically different environment. And I think, one thing that we can take from this is that this environment has created a space where absolutely change practice needs to change, because what we used to do won't work in this environment. Let's have a look at the increase of trauma impact in our workforce. So, trauma is a concept which is defined as the state of high arousal in which normal coping mechanisms are overwhelmed in response to threat. And there's a number of definitions around the types of trauma that are out there. I spoke about cumulative trauma. When you look at the literature, you will see it referencing acute trauma, which comes from a single unexpected and stressful event. Chronic trauma, which comes from repeated traumatic events, and then complex trauma, which involves multiple different kinds of traumatic events. And that's more about the response, how you actually process that and how you deal with that in a unique trauma way. Cumulative trauma tends to fit in between the space of chronic trauma and complex trauma, in that it is repeated traumatic events that are building up on you that present as perhaps a accelerated or an elevated state of high arousal. What we do know from the research that's out there is that 70% of the workforce have experienced one traumatic event. 25 to 30% of the workforce have exposure to multiple traumatic events, particularly so post-pandemic. So we can see that these numbers are starting to rise. We do have ways of working around trauma in organizations. So there are 4 stages to consider, and this is a hierarchy. So trauma aware is the baseline where people in the organization are aware of the concept of trauma and how that presents, how they might mitigate. And you go all the way through to trauma informed, where the whole of your organization is optimized for the experience of trauma in people. So policies, processes, systems, how you deal with people outside the organization, how you deal with people inside the organization is trauma informed. What we're talking about at this point for change practitioners is, if you can just get to the state of trauma aware, there's, your ability to be sensitive to people in what you're seeing in change will be increased, and so the likelihood of success improved. Let's look at the definition of what makes for a traumatic event. So events that represent a threat to safety, events where there's no clarity on the end date or time, and events where there is no control. You have no control over what's happening. And you will see then that there's a list of things that we can consider that would be considered a traumatic event. So the pandemic, climate crisis, floods and fires, wars, rise of fascist regimes, political and legal challenges to social justice and human rights matters is inherently traumatic for people that affects and those around them. Domestic violence, personal assault. Um, I think there's something to think about here in terms of we can consider continuous change in the workplace as traumatic if we use that definition when it is done poorly. And so this is really a wake-up call for change practitioners around, do no harm. Are you contributing to more trauma in the workplace, or are you working to mitigate? How do we know when we're seeing change recipients processing trauma? Well, often, and it's not always, but you can see elements of people having difficulty understanding new information, a reluctance to adopt change or try new things, increased interpersonal conflict, increased absenteeism, and lower productivity. If we look at the principles of trauma-informed leadership, many of you who have got a background in organizational development will say, well, this is what we've always been doing. This is how we have always designed change for. Safety, trustworthy and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice. And I'm going to sit out on a limb here and say, yes, these have been the ideals. These have been the principles. This has been the aspiration. But when I truly look back at a lot of change that has gone on in the organizations I'm in, even when they have been designed by practitioners with organizational development backgrounds, I would say that these principles have not been adhered to. And so I think, again, there's a real moment of reflection for us as change practitioners to say, okay, to what extent are we embodying these elements in our change? Similarly, there's a call out for us when we are delivering change to see if we can slow things down. If we know that people are struggling to process things, can we slow things down? Can we provide our information and our training in bite-sized pieces? What are we truly doing to co-create, empower, and provide choice? There's some things you're not going to be able to provide choice on. Decisions have been made, what the system is, but you can offer choice in how do we introduce this to your people. To what extent are you giving space to people to experiment and, extra social support by way of coaching and buddying? One of the important things to call out here is we're not asking you to be therapists. This is part of the pushback I've seen from change practitioners when we talk about trauma-informed change. Now, trauma-informed practice is not about the treatment of the trauma or the symptoms, but rather a recognition that trauma experiences are a possibility for anyone in the organisation, and we're going to design our change accordingly. Okay, let's have a look at the decline of brain function in the workplace. So this is showing up post-pandemic as three factors. So one, there is the cognitive decline on account of COVID neurological impact. And with this, I'm not talking about long COVID. The most recent research that's been done is showing that anybody who has had exposure to COVID has had the potential for the brain to be compromised in its functioning when it comes to memory, attention, and executive function. And this is a somewhat confronting fact that is coming out in the science at the moment. But nonetheless, it's one we need to think about with our workforce, is that they're not going to be able to hold memories and attention and executive function in the way that they've done before. Second, by very virtue of everything that's been going on post-pandemic and this escalation of really stressful events, we've seen an increase in what's known as allostatic load. And allostatic load refers to the cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events on your body and your brain. Third, there has been an elevation of depression and anxiety during and post-pandemic. Again, when you look at the statistics on this, it is incredibly confronting. So anxiety and depression doubled in the years 2019 to 2022. Some people some people have had to come out of the workplace because of the severity of that depression and anxiety, many are pushing on ahead. And so you will have many, many people in the workforce who are really struggling with depression and anxiety. And in some cases, there is a lot of support in that. We have normalized, thankfully, we have destigmatized what it means to have mental health conditions in the workforce. It will be having an impact on their ability to process change. And this presents as, what I would describe as a perfect change storm. A perfect storm is written about the authors in this article, A Perfect Storm: Social Media News, Psychological Biases, and AI. But when I was reading it, it was really interesting because it really spoke to what's happening to our work environment. So um, we are the ones responsible for introducing the constant developments in technology that are changing the way we work. We are the ones who are having to adopt new ways of social media to communicate our messages. And this has really created a perfect storm of uncertainty. And the authors say our ability to be able to predict even semi accurately has been compromised and has created considerable internal disequilibrium. And we see this when we go back to our brain being a prediction machine. This is why we are seeing what could be considered a perfect change storm. So let's have a look at what we're going to do with this as change practitioners with the COVID-related cognitive deficit, mental health, and change issues. The first thing is it's going to take people longer to review your artifacts and analysis, so you need to allow time. It does impact memory, how you layer new information, so expect to have to repeat your change rationale. You can see increased frustration in your stakeholders as they don't get it. So, from a change practitioner perspective, you need to consider not reacting and really activating your curiosity to what you see in front of you. You can see increased anxiety in your stakeholders as they're already operating at a higher baseline. And so, the importance of responding with empathy and compassion is very high. You want to think about scaffolding concepts. And what I mean by that is starting with what is the most simple, easy thing to understand and building the complexity on top of that. So, similarly, start sessions and meetings with a recap of how did you get here. So, let's just remind people, okay, we are here. And you might want to use a visual aid like a change process to say, follow the dots. This is where we started. This is where we are now. Show the milestones that we're passing. Use your Kanban boards, right? Anytime you're moving something from a backlog to doing to done, you're creating and elevating emotion. Progress releases dopamine. And then finally, increase social support for change, especially in hypercare. Okay, let us have a look at the third item, which was the increase of neurodiversity in the work. So when we look at the definition of neurodiversity, it's a term that describes differences in the way the brain works. The term neurodiversity has been chosen as a concerted effort to really show that it's about the strengths of a community or a cohort of people, in the same way that when we use biodiversity, it's considered a phrase that is helpful in thinking about we need biodiversity around us. There are four main neurominorities that we think about with neurodiversity and that are most commonly talked about. So ADHD, autism, DCD, and dyslexia. That said, it's an umbrella term. There are another dozen different diagnoses that occur outside of that in smaller numbers. And it is typically used to differentiate from the term neurotypical. We know that at the moment there are 16% of the workforce who identify as neurodiverse, and some of the research from Culture Amp suggests that the neurodiverse community have got strengths in processing information, creative thinking, elevated productivity, and ability to think differently. That said, there is no one neurodiverse profile. And so it's important to recognize that people may not always, so people may identify as neurodiverse, but not have those strengths. I think when you look at some of those strengths, though, there's a real call out for us as change practitioners to be explicitly recruiting people who identify as neurodiverse as our subject matter experts and our change champions. If we look at the stats, there has been a staggering 787% increase in diagnosis of autism over the last 20 years. Over the same time period, the last 20 years, we've seen a 68% increase in ADHD diagnosis. And over the last 2 years, the diagnosis of women with ADHD has nearly doubled. Some of you will be saying, how has this happened? It's an interesting story when you think about our tactics for change and how things change. First of all, there's been an increase in boundary expansion. So what it means to be neurodiverse used to be a fairly small set of parameters. It's now much wider. There is also less stigma attached to identifying as neurodiverse. In some ways, there's also a level of pride and, accomplishment in claiming the space of being someone who is neurodiverse. And we see this with the chili image. So the chili image refers to one of the common terms, and to my understanding, this is a self-referential term, so it's not necessarily something that if you were neurotypical, you would be using about neurodiverse people. But within the neurodiversity cohort, you find that they often refer to themselves as neurospicy, because this is, a light-hearted, fun way of talking about the challenges of what does it mean to have a brain that works differently to other people. I will call out, my understanding, that's a self-referential term. So if you want to start using neurospicy in your language, in your teams, you'd probably want to check in with those people who do identify as being neurodiverse to make sure that's okay. Second, I want to recognize that people in the neurodiverse community who don't like the term at all and find it diminishes the challenges that they face in the workforce. Third, we've got better diagnostics. So the advent of neuroscience technology, fMRIs, a whole stack of different ways of assessing things means that we're a lot more clever now at looking at brains and understanding what typical looks like, as opposed to those that work outside the parameters of typical. There is better awareness. You will know this from media in terms of how many famous people are coming out and identifying as ADHD and sharing their stories. How many people in our organizations are comfortable talking about their being on the autism spectrum and what that looks like in the workplace. So I think that less stigma and better awareness is really contributing to the increase in diagnostics. With that, you've also got increased access to healthcare that you certainly didn't have 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so that all comes together to really tell us why we're seeing this increase of neurodiversity in the workforce. So when I said before that not all neurodiverse profiles are the same, this is an example on the left-hand side, the image of what is considered a spiky profile. And neurodiverse people often have considerable differences in their scores across common brain functions. So verbal skills, working memory, visual skills, processing based. Not to say that that's the way it works for everybody. This is just an example against someone who is neurotypical, who might have 1 to 2 standard deviations across those areas, whereas people who are neurodiverse have considerably larger spikes between their scores. That said, so there is no typical neurodiverse profile. Everybody is different. However, one of the things, there are some areas that we can take some level of confidence that makes life easier for people who have neurodiverse profiles. One is they like structure. So the call out there for a change practitioner is be clear on your scaffolding and sequencing logic. Second, love simplicity. So strip away distraction, design, and words. Really like visual, so visual roadmaps are helpful, as are change walls and demonstrations. Often want a variety of training resources and support, so think about accessible learning design in the change programs that you're doing. And then the importance of data informed decision making. If there is no normal neurodiverse profile, you really need to rely on the data that's coming your way about how effective you are at delivering change to work out what you might need to change in how you deliver change. How many times could I say change in that sentence? Here's an example of how you might diversify your change communication. And I would encourage you to really think about being a content curator if you're seeking to create more accessible forms of change communication. Within your change program, you might be able to find photos from the workplace that represent moments that matter. Perhaps you want to do myth-busting 90-second videos, so short bites that you can put out on a regular basis. You do want to still continue with long-form explainers with detail. Some people want that level of detail to work through. Infographics for facts, things that are really highly visual. Authority pictures, so using quotes from leaders. And again, perhaps it's just the quote that you need rather than the full paragraph. If you're doing Q&As, then use one question a week. So when we talked about scaffolding, start with the most general questions and then start to build understanding a week at a time. Use iterative design showcases. And then if you're going to do emails or newsletters, turn them into postcards with hyperlinks to full information so you can keep things short and snappy. It represents this concept of pick and mix. You want to be able to have a whole stack of content available to you and then pick the pieces that are going to work best with your audience. Similarly, you can diversify your training. So this model here is one that we have used at the Agile Change Leadership Institute for some time, and it's about thinking about your training in terms of what extent is it structured? So is it formal or is it informal? And then is it led by others and self-directed? If you draw up this matrix and start to plot all of the training you thought you were going to do for your change program, you could find that there's some big gaps there and there's some real opportunities to do this a little bit differently from a more diversified approach to learning. So the goodish news with all that I have spoken about is we already have what are known as brain-friendly change tools out there. They come from the space of agility and agile change. I have said good-ish here. My challenge or the caveat to think about this, the double-edged sword, is what we're saying to be brain-friendly is you need to go slow. There are many times when the pursuit of agility or agile does not support the going of slow. It's about speeding it up. What you can take from that space, however, is, the ability to go small, the iterative change. Autonomy is baked in and empowerment is baked into the space of agile. The concept of chunking your change, of using really visual communication, data-informed feedback, but most of all, permission to adjust your approach is really core to the space of agile change. So these are some of the examples of the agile change tools, brain-friendly change tools that we've got in our playbook. Many of you will be familiar with them. What's important and what makes them brain-friendly is that they are highly visual, that they are all used to start and continue conversations with people. So this is not about completing the perfect spreadsheet and sending it to somebody. These are tools for co-creation. People get to really contribute to where are they on the releases, where are they on the roadmap. If we're using a Think Act field board, what does that tell us about their experience that they want to have with change? Let's have a look at the next steps. I think we can use a start, stop, maintain framework for this. In the short term, you want to build your agile and brain-friendly change skills. In the medium term, I think you've got to get really serious about change prioritization. Review your slate, slow down, or say no. This is a hard thing to do, and many of you will not be in positions of authority where you can influence this. But what I'm going to suggest is that you take away your key learning from this webinar and sit down and make a 3-page pitch to senior leaders to say what's happening in the brains of your workforce, what you need to do differently to be successful with the change that they are accountable for, and make this part of the recommendation. The third is a longer term goal, which is really the culture change piece about wellness, diversity, and inclusion. Most recently, the research is telling us that all of the wellness initiatives that we've been doing have not shifted the dial at all. In fact, in some places, it's gone backwards. I think the reason for this is that we have tried to focus on wellness without looking at the immediate stressor to that wellness. If we are not stopping and slowing down the change that we're introducing in the workplace, you cannot namaste your way out of bad change delivery and design and an overfull plate. It's as serious as that. The culture change is the one we want, but you need that preceding state to occur to be effective. My final thoughts on this. Brain-friendly change is a story of accessible design. So when we design change to be accessible for those with neurological variations and challenges, we make it better for everyone. You shouldn't have to think hard to get change. I hope this has been a helpful webinar for you. If we're not connected, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Let me know that you saw it. I wish you all the very best with your change going forward. Make sure that it is brain friendly, because our work is too important for it not to land.